Welcome back, legends. Before we start, subscribe and share this video right now. Comment below, where are you watching from? And what time is it? Let's explore Scary World. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been collecting climate data along the Appalachian Trail for 3 years before she encountered something that made her question whether she should continue. She was a researcher with the National Atmospheric Sciences Institute, and her work involved setting up automated weather stations at specific elevations along remote sections of the trail. The equipment was sophisticated sensors that measured temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind patterns every 15 minutes, transmitting data via satellite to her lab in Virginia. In October 2019, Elena hiked into a section of trail in northern Georgia, about 8 miles from the nearest road. She was checking on a station she'd installed 6 months earlier, expecting routine maintenance, replacing batteries, cleaning sensors, downloading backup data. The hike-in had been normal. She'd passed 2 other hikers around mile marker 4, exchanged pleasantries about the unseasonably warm weather, and continued on. The weather station was located 50 feet off the trail, in a small clearing that provided an unobstructed view of the sky. Elena had chosen the spot specifically because it was isolated from the thermal effects of the trail itself. No radiant heat from exposed rock, no cooling from dense canopy. When she reached the clearing, the first thing she noticed was that the station's solar panel was covered in leaves, which was odd because there was no wind and the trees around the clearing were still full of foliage. She cleared the panel and powered up her laptop to download the data. The station had been collecting readings continuously since her last visit, creating a dataset of roughly 17,000 individual measurements. As the file transferred, Elena ate a protein bar and checked her GPS. She was making good time. She'd be back at her car before sunset. Then she opened the data file. The temperature readings were impossible. According to the sensors, at 3:47 a.m. on September 23rd, the temperature had dropped from 62 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 18 degrees in the span of 4 minutes. Then it had climbed back to 61 degrees over the next 6 minutes. The sensors showed this same pattern had repeated every night for 3 weeks. Sudden, extreme drops in temperature lasting between 8 and 12 minutes, always occurring between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. Elena's first assumption was equipment failure. Temperature sensors could malfunction, especially after months of exposure to the elements. But when she examined the station, everything appeared functional. The sensors were clean, the connections were solid, and the battery voltage was normal. She ran a diagnostic check. Every component passed. She looked at the humidity data. During each temperature drop, the humidity readings also showed extreme fluctuations, rising to 98% saturation and then dropping to 12% in minutes. The barometric pressure readings showed similar impossible changes, swings. That would indicate the station had suddenly been transported to a different elevation, then returned. What disturbed Elena most was that these readings had internal consistency. If the sensors had been malfunctioning randomly, the data would have been chaotic. Instead, the temperature, humidity, and pressure readings all correlated in ways that suggested they were measuring something real, just something that shouldn't exist. She decided to leave the station in place and return with additional equipment. She wanted a second station nearby to provide comparison data, and she wanted to set up a trail camera to see if there was something in the clearing at night, an animal, a person, something that might explain the readings. As Elena packed up her laptop, she noticed the air had gotten colder. She checked her handheld thermometer. 58 degrees. The sun was still up, and the day had been warm. A 10-degree drop in 20 minutes wasn't normal, but it wasn't impossible. She shouldered her pack and walked back toward the trail. Before she reached the trees, she turned and looked at the clearing one more time. The light had changed. The shadows were longer than they should have been, and the quality of the sunlight looked wrong, more like late evening than mid-afternoon. Elena checked her watch. 3:47 p.m. She walked faster. When she reached the trail, she heard footsteps behind her. Quick, light steps like someone running. She turned around. The trail was empty. The footsteps stopped. She waited, listening. The forest was completely silent, no birds, no insects, no wind. After a minute, she continued hiking. The footsteps started again as soon as she began walking. They matched her pace exactly, staying about 20 feet behind her. Every time she stopped, they stopped. She tried walking slower. The footsteps slowed. She tried speeding up. They accelerated. Elena considered calling out, asking who was there, but something stopped her. The footsteps didn't sound quite right. The rhythm was correct, the spacing was appropriate for human walking, but there was something off about the sound itself, too sharp, too clear, like someone walking on hard ground even though the trail here was covered in soft leaves. She checked her thermometer again. 51 degrees. The temperature was still dropping. At mile marker 6, Elena started jogging. The footsteps behind her matched her pace. She could hear them clearly now, steady, relentless, maintaining that exact distance. She ran faster. The footsteps accelerated. She was breathing hard, her pack bouncing against her back, and the footsteps were still there, still 20 feet behind, and the temperature was 46 degrees. When she reached mile marker 5, the trail opened into an area where recent logging had cleared the trees on one side. Elena ran into the sunlight and stopped, gasping for air. She turned around, pulling out her phone, ready to take a picture or call for help or do something. The trail was empty. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was silent. Her thermometer read 67 degrees. Elena stood there for 5 minutes, catching her breath, waiting for something to appear. Nothing did. Eventually, she continued hiking, checking behind her every few minutes. She didn't hear the footsteps again. When she reached her car 2 hours later, the sun was setting and the temperature was a normal 59 degrees. She returned to the station 3 weeks later with a colleague and additional equipment. The new data showed the same impossible temperature fluctuations, but only from the original station. The second station, placed 40 feet away, recorded completely normal readings. The trail camera captured nothing unusual, just darkness, then dawn, night after night. Elena collected 1 more month of data, then she removed both stations. Her official report attributed the anomalous readings to a sensor malfunction, even though she never identified what had actually failed. She's never hiked that section of trail again. According to her GPS logs, the clearing where she placed the weather station is located at exactly 3,847 feet above sea level. She's never found it on any map. Trail counters are simple devices, pressure sensors buried under the trail that detect footsteps and transmit data to a central database. They're used by park services to estimate trail usage, plan maintenance, and allocate resources. The devices are reliable, unobtrusive, and they generate thousands of data points every season. In most cases, the data is unremarkable. But in August 2021, a trail counter on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia began recording numbers that made no sense. The counter had been installed by the Forest Service in June, placed at a location where the trail crossed a narrow ridge about 14 miles from the nearest road. The area wasn't popular, maybe. 20 hikers passed through in a typical summer month. The counter was checked remotely via satellite uplink, and for the first 6 weeks, it recorded exactly what was expected. Occasional hikers, groups of 2 or 3, activity clustered on weekends. Then, on August 12th, the counter recorded 847 northbound passages in a single night. When the anomaly was flagged by the automated system, rangers assumed it was a malfunction. Trail counters sometimes generated false positives. A falling branch could trigger the sensor. Heavy rain could cause problems. Animals could set it off if they walked directly over the sensor. But 847 consecutive activations was unprecedented. The sensor had recorded a passage every 7 to 8 seconds for nearly 2 hours, starting at 11:43 p.m. and ending at 1:38 a.m. A ranger named Philip Chun was assigned to hike in and check the device. He made the trip on August 18th, approaching from the south. The hike took him about 5 hours. The trail was in good condition, and he didn't encounter any other hikers. When he reached the counter's location, he found the device undisturbed, properly buried, functioning normally. He downloaded the data logs and examined the installation site for signs of animal activity, erosion, or vandalism. Everything looked fine. Philip sat on a rock and reviewed the data on his tablet. The 847 passages had been recorded with remarkable consistency, 7 to 9 seconds between each activation, moving in the same direction for 115 minutes. If these had been hikers, they would have been moving at a normal walking pace, single file, maintaining steady spacing. But that made no sense. Who would be on this trail at midnight? And where would 847 people have come from? He checked the historical data. Before August 12th, the counter had recorded normal patterns. After August 12th, it had gone back to normal patterns. The anomaly was isolated to that single night. Philip decided to leave the counter in place and monitor it remotely. If it happened again, the Forest Service would send a team to investigate more thoroughly. It happened again on August 19th. This time, the counter recorded 1,203 northbound passages, starting at 11:51 p.m. and continuing until 3:14 a.m. Same pattern-consistent spacing, steady pace, all moving in the same direction. Philip returned to the location on August 21st with a camera and motion-activated floodlights. He set up the equipment 30 feet from the trail, angled to capture anyone passing over the sensor. Then he hiked out and drove home, planning to return in 3 days to check the footage. On August 22nd, the counter recorded 982 passages. On August 23rd, 1,107. On August 24th, 8:56 every night, starting around midnight, continuing for hours. When Philip returned on August 25th to retrieve the camera, he found the equipment exactly where he'd left it. The camera had captured footage from 3 nights. He sat down and watched it on his laptop. The footage showed the trail at night illuminated by moonlight. Trees on both sides, the narrow path cutting across the ridge, nothing unusual. At 11:49 p.m. on August 22nd, the motion-activated lights triggered. They stayed on for 3 hours and 17 minutes. During that entire time, the camera recorded nothing. Just an empty trail, lights on, no movement, no animals, no people. Just the trail. But Philip could hear something on the audio track. Footsteps, steady, rhythmic footsteps, continuous for hours, the sound of hundreds of people walking past the camera, but the video showed nothing. He checked the other nights. Same thing. Lights triggered, footsteps clearly audible, video showing an empty trail. Philip packed up the equipment and hiked out. He filed a report with the Forest Service, describing the counter data and the camera footage. His supervisor reviewed the materials and suggested the audio was wind, noise, or the sound of the camera's own electronics. Philip didn't argue, but he didn't agree. He'd been hiking in these mountains for 15 years. He knew what wind sounded like. He knew what equipment interference sounded like. The footsteps sounded like people. The Forest Service decided to remove the trail counter, officially because they were reallocating resources to higher traffic areas. They didn't install a replacement. Philip never hiked that section of trail at night. He did hike it during the day several times, partly because it was his job and partly because he needed to know if he'd feel anything unusual. He never did. The trail was just a trail, narrow ridge, good views, unremarkable. But he talked to other rangers quietly, asking if anyone had experienced anything strange in that area. 2 rangers mentioned that hikers occasionally reported feeling uncomfortable on that stretch of trail. They couldn't articulate just a sense that they weren't alone, that they should move faster, that they shouldn't be there after dark. One ranger mentioned that the trail had been rerouted in the 1970s because the original path had become unstable. The old trail had run about a quarter-mile east, along a different part of the ridge. Philip found a topographic map from 1968 that showed the original route. He hiked to the old trail in September 2021. It was barely visible, overgrown, eroded, reclaimed by the forest. He followed it for about a mile until it became impassable. He didn't find anything unusual. No structures, no signs, no indication of what the trail had been used for before it became part of the Appalachian Trail system. But when he checked historical records at the county library, he found a reference to the ridge in a memoir written by a surveyor in 1891. The surveyor described the ridge as a path much traveled by those no longer requiring roads. Philip couldn't find any clarification of what that meant. The surveyor's other descriptions were straightforward and literal measurements, landmarks, geological features. That one phrase stood alone, unexplained. The trail counter data is still stored in the Forest Service database. The files are flagged as containing anomalous readings, but they haven't been deleted. Philip has moved to a different district. He doesn't talk about the hiker count anymore. The section of trail where the counter was installed remains open. Hikers pass through regularly. According to official records, it's one of the quieter sections of the Aayat. On still nights when there's no wind, some hikers report hearing footsteps. Mycological research on the Appalachian Trail is unglamorous work. It involves hiking into remote areas, collecting soil and organic matter, cataloging fungal specimens, and hauling samples back to the lab. Dr. Tom Whitmore had been doing this work for 8 years when he collected samples from a location that ended his career. Tom was a research mycologist with a university in Pennsylvania, specializing in fungal networks, the underground mycelial structures that connect trees and facilitate nutrient exchange. His work was part of a larger study, examining how these networks varied. Along the length of the Appalachian Trail, from Georgia to Maine, the research was methodical, systematic, and entirely routine. In June 2018, Tom hiked to a designated collection site in western North Carolina, about 12 miles from the nearest parking area. He was working alone, which was standard for this type of research. The collection protocol was simple. Dig soil cores at marked GPS coordinates. Seal the samples. Label everything, hike out. He'd done it hundreds of times. The collection site was in a cove hardwood forest, thick with mature trees and a dense understory. Tom arrived around noon and began the collection process. The soil was dark, rich, exactly what he'd expected. He dug his first core sample, sealed it in a sterile container, and moved to the next collection point, 30 feet away. At the second point, his coring tool hit something solid about 8 inches down. This wasn't unusual. Rocks, roots, and old wood were common obstacles. Tom adjusted the angle and tried again. He hit the same obstruction. He knelt down and used his hands to clear away the loose soil. He found bone. It was a fragment about 4 inches long, smooth and white. Tom was trained in field biology and he'd encountered animal remains before. This didn't look like a deer bone or a bear bone. It looked human, but he wasn't a forensic expert, and he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He carefully excavated around the fragment, trying to determine if it was an isolated piece or part of a larger skeleton. He found more bones. Lots of them. As he cleared the soil, he uncovered what appeared to be dozens of fragments, scattered in a rough circle about 3 feet in diameter. They were mixed with the soil at various depths, some near the surface, some deeper. The arrangement didn't look like a burial site. It looked like the bones had been distributed, scattered, mixed into the ground deliberately. Tom stopped digging. This was beyond his area of responsibility. If these were human remains, he needed to report it to authorities. He took several photographs with his field camera, noted the GPS coordinates, and backed away from the site. He decided to collect samples from the other designated points first. Then hike at the third collection point, he found more bones. Same pattern fragments scattered in the soil, mixed with organic matter, no indication of a burial. At the fourth point, same thing. By the time he'd worked through all 8 collection points, he'd encountered bone fragments at 6 of them. The sites were spread over a 100-yard area, following a rough line up the slope. Tom sealed his samples and prepared to hike out. As he packed his equipment, he noticed the light in the forest had changed. It looked darker under the canopy, even though it was early afternoon. The understory vegetation, which had been green and vibrant when he arrived, now looked faded. He checked his watch. 1:47 p.m. He'd been working for less than 2 hours. He shouldered his pack and started walking back to the trail. Before he'd gone 20 feet, he noticed the trees. Every single tree in his immediate vicinity was dead. Not recently dead, these were standing dead trees, bark falling off, branches bare, wood gray and cracked. He'd walked past these same trees on his way in. They'd been alive. Tom stopped walking. He was a scientist, and he was trying to apply rational explanations to what he was seeing. Mass tree death didn't happen in hours. His memory had to be wrong. He had to be misremembering what the forest had looked like earlier. Except he'd been trained in field observation. His job required accurate visual memory, and he was certain, absolutely certain, that these trees had been alive 2 hours ago. He turned around and looked at the collection sites. From his current position, he could see 3 of the locations where he dug. The soil at each site was disturbed, marked by small depressions where he'd removed his cores. As he watched, the depressions began to fill. Soil was moving, flowing slowly back into the holes, smoothing over the disturbed areas. He watched for 30 seconds. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. Tom walked quickly to the trail. When he reached it, he turned and looked back at the collection area. The forest looked normal green understory, living trees, dappled sunlight. He checked his GPS. He was at the correct coordinates. He'd just come from the collection site. But the forest he was looking at now didn't match what he'd seen 2 minutes earlier. He hiked out faster than necessary, stopping every half mile to check his GPS and confirm he was on the correct path. The hike back took him 3 hours. When he reached his vehicle, he loaded his samples and sat in the driver's seat, trying to decide what to report. He'd found bones. That was factual, documentable. The rest, the dead trees, the moving soil, the change in the forest, he had no evidence for any of it. Tom drove to the county sheriff's office and reported the bone fragments. He provided GPS coordinates and photographs. The sheriff's deputy listened politely, took notes, and said they'd investigate. Tom left his contact information and drove home. A week later, a detective called him. They'd sent a team to the coordinates he'd provided. They didn't find any bone fragments. They dug test holes at each of Tom's collection points. No bones, no disturbance, no indication that anyone had been there recently. The detective asked Tom if he was certain about the location. Tom confirmed the GPS coordinates. The detective said they'd close the case unless new evidence appeared. Tom examined his soil samples in the lab. 5 of the 8 samples contained bone fragments, small pieces, heavily mineralized, consistent with being in the ground for many years. He sent samples to a colleague who specialized in forensic anthropology. The analysis confirmed the fragments were human, but the mineralization patterns were unusual. The bones appeared to have been in the soil for at least 50 years, but the degree of mineralization suggested much longer centuries, possibly. More disturbing was the fungal analysis. The mycelial networks in the samples were unlike anything Tom had documented before. The structures were dense, organized in patterns that suggested active growth, but when he tried to culture the fungi in the lab, they wouldn't grow. They appeared healthy under microscopic examination, but they were completely inactive. It was as if the fungi were alive but suspended, waiting for something. Tom wrote up his findings in a technical report, focusing on the unusual fungal structures and omitting the details about the dead trees and the moving soil. He submitted the report to his department head. It was returned with a note suggesting that the samples had been contaminated and that Tom should recollect from the same site. He never went back. He requested reassignment to a different project, and when that was denied, he took a leave of absence. That leave became permanent. He's no longer affiliated with the university. He works as a consultant for agricultural companies now, testing soil for commercial growers, work that never takes him into the mountains. The soil samples from that collection are still stored in a freezer at the university, labeled and cataloged. No one has examined them since Tom's initial analysis. The collection site remains active on the research project's GPS database. According to the records, no one has visited since 2018. Tom kept his field notes from that day. 37 pages, handwritten, documenting every observation, every measurement, every anomaly. On the last page, he wrote a single sentence. "The ground remembers things we've tried to forget." He's never explained what he meant by that.